This show is one that, when Dr. Ray started, was definitely about destigmatizing sex, and I think in particular pornography. It's always been part of the mission. So for the past 4 years doing this show, we have talked about so-called ethical porn. We've talked about porn directed at women. We've talked about porn directed by women. We've talked to sex educators, to role players, to addiction specialists, and out of control sexual behavior therapists, cam artists, hypnotists, audio performers, simulated girlfriends, all kinds of different content creators. And when we first launched this show, I wrote an article for the ACA's magazine talking about the know it when I see it standard that we historically apply to porn. And even after all of that and all of this time, I'd still like to ask y'all a pretty straightforward question, which is just, what the hell even is porn?
Well, I think that anything that's, content or media that is designed to titillate, if you will.
Sure.
Anything that's designed to spark your erotic imagination, that's porn. And so obviously there's a lot of mainstream movies that utilize that. Even commercials sometimes. I mean,
Yeah, it's awkward. Like,
Right.
is there a true line between, quote, erotica or pornography or just a nude of Venus? I mean, like when we start looking at art of any stripe, it gets really messy.
Right, I think that the lines are really subjective and really dubious and fuzzy, but I really think that they're culturally defined, and I think that it shifts, not just from, like, time period to time period, but even, like, person to person within a culture. Because
Yeah.
there are like, Sinn hit the nail on the head, like, there are some movies that in any other context that would be considered porn, but because they put it in a rated R movie with a broader context and it's a shorter scene, maybe not the whole point of the movie, we can get away with not calling it porn. But what it does in a person's head is the exact same thing, and the purpose, like, what it's conveying is the exact same thing. So I'm right there with Sin. I think that porn can be defined in so many different ways, but what is it for the individual that is erotic? Or I love that she used the word like titillating, like I love it, tantalizing, whatever you want to call it. Like if
yeah.
it just gets you going. But I think honestly, to me, the more fascinating question is like what is the line between what we consider to be appropriate gestures of like sexuality or displays of sexuality, and then this whole like moral gray ground into it's porn, but in a bad way, right?
Right. Yeah. Porn, but in a bad way, is
Yeah.
definitely a weird one. I uh, am in a number of different like social media groups with other therapists, and there was a question that came up today about a client in a group home setting with pretty profound neurological needs who was interested in pornography but didn't have the ability to access it themselves. And
Mhm.
so it started this chat about like how to appropriately supply resources and things like that. And it was just amazing how many educated professionals, helping professionals whose entire job is centered around caring for people and working to understand people were just blanket statement, all porn is, quote, inappropriate, whatever that even actually means, and completely not okay, particularly for somebody with a, quote, disability. And that is just so challenging and problematic on so many different levels.
I find it
It kinda
dehumanizing,
Sure.
because
yeah.
just because someone has a disability, or you know that they're not allowed to engage in adult activities as adults, like
Right.
they're not allowed to have desires, physical, sexual curiosities, even. That's dehumanizing and so
Yeah.
unfair
And
and
in
so
that case,
limited.
really, yeah, I mean that example really points to the way that we sort of generally tend to infantilize folks who
Oh,
have
yeah.
neurological struggles and these different things, and see them as like young people in adult bodies rather than adults who just have a different form of cognition. But the notion that there was no context in which pornography would be appropriate is just incredibly frustrating for me.
Well, and it kinda shows that, like, no matter what profession you're in and no matter your intelligence level, your filters, like those cultural and religious filters that we get raised with that are
Hmm.
so strongly embedded in us subconsciously can still impact us. So no matter how good of a therapist you might be, if you have these sort of filters that porn is bad no matter what, you're going to filter all of your clients through that. You're going to filter all of your approaches through that. And
Hmm.
so now you have people who, as much as they can help in any other realm, when it comes to the realm of sex, they become really, they can even be more harmful.
Very narrow-minded, and
Hmm.
that's why, for example, that's why, the adult industry several years ago sort of adopted, there's this company called Pineapple Support, and that what it is to connect you with sex positive therapists. So
Mm.
a lot of us, like the general population, struggle with some mental health issues and things like this, and we'll go, or even couple stuff that's going on, and we'll go to a counselor for help, and we'll be like, okay, so we're both in the adult industry and we're exploring non-monogamy, and then the therapist is like, well, there's your problems, there they are,
Yeah.
Right.
stop
Yeah.
doing those
Yeah.
things and
End
you'll
of
be better.
conversation.
Yeah, and so it's like we have to then struggle to find people who will accept that that's a part of us, and then work to help us solve these issues with that being a part of our lives, and who we are, so it's challenging for everyone to you know to have that open mind, like as a even as a therapist. I mean, therapists are human beings still with all those cultural filters and all that stuff. So
No question. I mean, the stories that I hear from folks who become my clients when they mention, the twists and turns of plot that brought them to me, it makes sense to me why folks whose issues have nothing to do with their sexuality want to come to me, just because they know they're not going to be judged because they are also a sex worker. I mean, maybe they're wanting to go to
Mm.
therapy because they want to mourn the loss of a parent. And I don't in particular specialize in grief work, but they know that I'm not going to judge them. And there's a lot of that kind of dynamic going on.
yeah.
Well, that
When
makes me wonder, not just with people in the sex industry, but with people who are struggling with something sex related who are also looking for a therapist. Like you said, even if the specific problem that they're looking for doesn't have anything to do with sex, but they know that that's part of their dynamic and it's going to come up, whether it's their sexual behaviors or like sexuality. How often
Mhm.
are people shying away from medical help because they don't want to have to divulge that information, or because they're going to be shamed for it, or fear that they are?
Yeah.
Yeah, no question. Well,
Yeah.
getting back to our conversation about porn, I guess I'm wondering if there are any particular ingredients that feel necessary. Does it have to include nudity? Does it have to include direct references to sex or sexual acts, or power dynamics, or quote eroticism, whatever that word actually ends up meaning? Is there anything vital to that word pornography?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it does have to be exploring sexuality or sensuality on some level, right? Um, and I guess it is just like erotica porn. I mean, I think there are the same things, but it's like Laura was saying, it depends on the filter. It's
Mhm.
it's different
Mhm.
for every person. Something that's really interesting to me is like, is porn art? And
Yeah.
my definition of art has got to be super broad. So what does it have to include to be porn? It's hard to say, but when I'm like reaching out to a new model, I'll say to them, like, the type of work that I know I'm going to want them to do is explicit, or
Mhm.
hardcore. So I'm
Mm.
like, do you do hardcore explicit, not just
Right.
wrestling or softcore? And that to me means like you're seeing a person's genitals, like
Mm, mhm.
definitely going to see the whole thing. Um, so, but that's not quite the same as, saying, is it porn? I mean, if it has that, yes, definitely. I
Sure.
don't think it needs that to be porn, but again, that's that sort of wavy line.
Well, and when it comes to video content, we at least have enough of a cultural lexicon. We talk so much about genre,
Mhm.
and we all recognize the difference between streaming and broadcast, and
Right.
these 30-minute quote
Yeah.
comedies and these hour-long quote dramas, and these kind of somewhat arbitrary but at least culturally agreed upon lines. But when we start branching out from video, I mean, is erotic audio pornography? Is, a dime store novel? I think generally on some of these things we would say yes, but as you get further and further afield, I mean, YouTube, as we all know, despises the notion of sex or people talking about things like pornography on their platform.
Mhm.
Sorry. But there are countless ASMR role play, romantic or
Right.
erotic, et cetera, et
Yeah.
cetera. And a lot of
Mhm.
those feature different power dynamics. A lot of those feature what we might broadly refer to as kink. Is that
Yeah.
porn? Like,
Well,
it
and
gets really messy.
kink is a great point too that I wanted to bring up a little bit, is that like I make, half of the custom videos that I make, it's like we remain fully clothed the entire time. I think I made one where I was like pretending that a ghost was beating me up. And so I was throwing myself around the room. I was wearing jeans, it had to be jeans, it had to be sneakers, like a specific, but I was fully clothed and I was just throwing myself around the room. And that was the clip. Is that porn? I mean, I feel 100% sure that someone is jerking off to it. Is that
Yeah.
what makes it porn?
Yeah, so
I mean,
is
that's
porn in the eye of the beholder? If you're watching that like PG-13 movie and everybody is kissing, and that's something that you go back and rewind, you are by yourself. Maybe you're at a young age having like one of your first erotic experiences. Is that pornography now in your mind, even if it's the same family movie that you comfortably watched with your grandparents earlier that night?
Or like some
that's why
cruel.
I think that That's why I
Yeah.
think that with so many terms, it has to be taken really, really loosely, and we have to understand context, right? Because there's what's porn to this specific individual, meaning what turns them on, and like literally, there's as many different triggers to turn someone on as there are people on this planet.
Sure.
Um, and so then there's that, and then there's also the what do we kind of culturally categorize as porn for the purposes of like categorizing for does it belong on Netflix or does it belong on Pornhub, or like how do we keep certain types of media away from certain age groups or demographics, right? And so we have this sort of more rigid definition of porn that I still think is somewhat subjective, but I think that the best way to oversimplify that and discuss like quote unquote what is porn culturally is the main purpose of it to elicit like sexual desire and sexual
Mm-hmm.
like stimulation, right? And that could be
Does it
like what
have like
Sin said, any number
redeeming
of things.
artistic value outside of its erotic components? Is often a
Right.
framework that's used
Oh,
legally, but
Right.
artistic value,
Totally
quote
subjective.
unquote,
yeah.
right? Yeah, like that's
And
a
that's
that's a
obviously
really
like
challenging notion.
thinking a lot about 50
Yeah.
Shades of Grey, right?
I was
And
just
then
gonna
all
mention
the
that. Why is
knockoffs,
it not porn?
right?
Yeah.
I mean, you see some fairly, I mean,
I mean,
I
does
don't want to say like
Bridgerton have
hardcore, but
artistic value outside of the sexuality? That's a valid question, right?
a
Right. And for
very
some it
subjective.
probably does, but
Hmm.
Sure. Well, with all of this being so vague and difficult to nail down, I guess it makes a certain amount of sense that porn is frequently a area of argument between couples. Like, what is a acceptable form of porn in your relationship, and where should we be drawing the lines? Should we be drawing the lines for each other? I mean, how do y'all feel about the bodily autonomy and just sort of like the relational ethics of pornography?
I feel really strongly about this, but I'm gonna give Sin the first
Yeah.
shot at it.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I have some strong feelings about those things. I think that, when we're in a partnership in a relationship, like we have to really let go of this idea that we control not only the body of our partner but also the mind of our
Mm,
partner.
sure.
We really have to realize that, like, as much as our little egos want us to be the only thing that exists in our partner's life, like that's a huge burden on top of the fact of it being absolutely impossible. It's a standard that like no human being could possibly live up to. So I think that yeah, letting people like view things and watch things and think about things, like it's okay for my partner to be thinking about someone else when he's having sex with me. Like that's all right. Like, I don't need to hear about
Right.
it or whatever,
Sure.
but I am not I can't be inside his mind. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about like mindfulness and sex, and we can talk about, how we don't necessarily need to tell our partners everything that we're thinking,
Of
particularly how
course.
unkind that notion of like radical, violently aggressive
Honest.
honesty can be. But yeah, it's important to remember that we are never made healthier by aggressively and violently policing our thoughts, and we don't owe anybody our thoughts.
Yes.
Well, and I think that we make the mistake in this society a lot of having this really strong, rigid, what we call like the marriage contract, right? Like it almost binds a person to you, and in a way that's very rigid and unchanging, especially as people change over the years. But as it specifically pertains to porn, um, the way that I think it should be handled, not that it is oftentimes, is
Sure.
that each individual is free to be that individual within the relationship. Your job is not to tell them what to do, what to say, what to think, what to feel, what to watch in terms of porn. Your job is to determine, is that acceptable to me? And is that something that I want in my life? Is that a person that I want to be around? And if that's uncomfortable for you, that's your line to draw, but not in terms of limiting the individual, but in terms of you determining what presence you want to have in that individual's life. Right? So like I
Yeah.
don't have any problem with porn for any like my partner, me, whatever. But if an individual does, it's not to say you are not allowed to watch porn. It's to say I'm uncomfortable with you watching porn. Now let's talk about it.
Sure.
Right?
And now let's talk about it being like the key.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, right,
Well,
let's discuss it, and I get to determine whether or not
Yeah.
I can ultimately get over it or if I'm gonna leave the
Right.
relationship.
I mean,
Right.
I think that's fair. I mean, using that framework, is it unethical or inappropriate or unhealthy to end a relationship or to not enter into a relationship because your partner or the person you're interested in is, a huge Nickelback fan and is obsessed with Dane Cook or something like that? Like, is it wrong to want to break up with somebody because of the media that they consume or to label people in that way?
I mean, I
No.
feel like it's
Yeah.
a it
Yeah, so
feels
Dane Cook and German dungeon porn, like those are my boundaries, and
And
it's
that's just
not
what it
yucking
is.
anybody else's yum. I just don't want to be in relationship with that.
okay. The way you just now put it, I can understand a little bit more, but I don't know. It feels like a little bit, I don't know if shallow is the right word. Like, I mean, there are things that I love, and I'm like, I wish my partner loved these things as much as I
Mhm.
did,
Sure.
but I accept the fact that it's not for him. And like, we're two separate human beings, and that is okay.
Well, and maybe if we play with it a little bit more, it might be quote tacky to break up with your partner because their favorite
Mhm.
comedian is not your favorite comedian. But if your partner is like a religious Joe Rogan listener or something along those lines,
Okay.
now all of a sudden it might feel like that's not so much an ethical gray area, or at least it's
Right.
acceptable to draw that line for yourself.
Well, see, that's the thing is it's always gonna be subjective, but we tend to think that we don't have as much control over choosing our partners as we really do, and I think a lot of it comes down to fear and insecurity and not wanting to be alone, right?
Sure.
But as shallow as that person is who doesn't wanna date somebody because they like Nickelback, get on with it, be shallow, like, do it because
If that's who
it's
you
better for
are,
you to
like be who you
self-eliminate.
are.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
because that partner also probably could benefit from not having you as their partner, right? Because you're now bringing also a dynamic that might not be the healthiest for them. So I say, like, people can be as arbitrary and shallow and silly as they want with their expectations. What I would like to see is just people being more clear with their expectations, right?
Yeah. No, I think that that's
Certainly we should
good
train people to
relational ethics, to
yeah.
be explicit about your lines, to live and let live, but to be willing
Yeah.
to walk away and not have that scarcity mindset around love, to be able to end a relationship without calling that relationship a failure or like
Yes.
othering or demonizing
Right.
your ex. I mean,
Yeah.
all of that makes good sense to me, but on maybe less of an ethical, but perhaps like a moral level, as you are trying to negotiate and renegotiate and maintain and compromise a long-standing relationship, how appropriate is it to say, no more opera in the house, or no more like BBW content in the garage? Like, yeah, are there
Hmm.
lines that we should or should not be allowed to maybe ask for or to communicate to our partners in that way?
That's so interesting. It's well, especially, when you're talking about, like, for example, like, no more BBW content. Okay, so I could see a partner coming at that to their partner and being like, I don't like the way that, these bodies are being fetishized. Watch other
Sure.
stuff. But
Or it makes me feel challenged around my own body dysphoria
Right.
or my
right,
desirability and these things. I mean, there's a
yes,
potential space for that. I think.
but I think it has to
I
be done with that sort of open-minded conversation, because again,
mm,
like, ultimately we're talking about what's going on in someone's mind, and it's like, for me to tell my partner, like, that makes me have all these feelings, so don't do it anymore. And then that person's like, probably in their head knows, now I have to find a way to do this without my partner knowing about it, because I can't change what their kinks are, their fetishes, or their turn ons. Like, no matter how much I tell them that, like, I can't change that for them. And for most people, those things are pretty hardwired, like what you like. And so I don't think we can expect that to change either. I think the boundaries, knowing your boundaries when you enter into a relationship, are extremely important. Like, so when I started my relationship with my partner, the second fucking date, I was like, kids, politics, religion. We're talking about this now because those are my hard boundaries, right?
Yeah.
absolutely. Before I get too attached to you and start making concessions, yeah.
Oh, yeah,
Mm.
exactly, and I
Yeah.
don't wanna be, 3 years in, and he's like, "Okay, well, now let's get married," and then we get married, and it's like, "Okay, well, when are we making kids?" And it's like, "Oh, shit, I didn't want
I'll hold
them."
the phone.
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah, it's like, we need to be talking about that, and I feel like it's the same, before you enter into, long-term commitments. I mean, that you kinda need to talk about porn a little bit, like,
Yeah.
after your sexual relationship has started, maybe you don't need to lay it all out on the table and be like, "Okay, I like watching girls piss in guys' mouths," or whatever. But that conversation needs to be had, especially about, like, consumption of porn and stuff like that. I think it's really important.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
do think that there's a lot of space for recognizing that anytime we spend, 1 minute doing something, it's a minute spent not spent doing something else. And I do think that it's reasonable to have requests, if not demands, of our partner's time and attention and things like that. Not to mention just shared living space. The idea
Sure.
of like loud pornography being played while the kids are in the house or while you're in a work meeting or all of these kinds of things. There's space to work around each other so long as we're actually doing the work of working around each other and communicating about what we need without bringing a bunch of like shame or judgment into that space.
Yeah, I was gonna say a lot of it comes down to being willing to negotiate because not any one partner is gonna get 100% of what they want, and so it's not a matter of like, "Oh, well, you're doing this in the garage, and now suddenly I'm not okay with it, and so it needs to stop," right? Like,
Hmm.
nobody's gonna exactly get what they want, or I'm gonna do it in the garage whether you like it or not, and that's all there is to it, right? There has to be a lot of, like, give and take and negotiation and compromises, but, Sin brought up a really good point when she mentioned that the kinks, and, like, there are certain things that are in a way non-negotiable because it's who the person is, right? Like,
Yeah.
if they have a partner who's, say, like, bisexual and they're like, "Well, I only want you to be straight," right? And, like, "I don't want you to talk about your bisexuality. I don't want you to, like, say that there's a hot girl on the screen. You can only say hot
Right?
guys," like, or whatever the lines are. Like, you can't really change who a person is, and
Yeah,
so in
good
that
luck with
respect,
that.
there's no negotiation. Yeah, like, it's just a,
Uh,
"Here's who I am, take me or leave me," and we have to be more willing, to have that harder conversation when negotiations ultimately aren't gonna be helpful.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
for sure. And I know that, like, if we're having sex, we're doing a sexual encounter, like, maybe I'm like really into watching my partner do some jerking off, but I don't want, like, as much as he doesn't want to be caught, I don't want to catch him, but, like, so his concession is that, and it's not even a wild one, but, when he knows I'm going to be gone from the house for several hours and he's going to be here, I just know in my head he's watching porn and jerking off, and that's fine. Like, I
And be
think it's
respectful of
good.
it, yeah.
I think it's healthy, yeah. But, I'm just like, please just don't, like, go in the other room and do it while I'm in the room. Just wait until you've got a little space, or you're in the shower and I'm leaving you alone. Like, you know what I mean? And I think, again, those concessions and those compromises, like it's not too difficult.
Yeah, I mean, you can have bodily autonomy and not get up in the middle of like Sunday night family dinner to go and take a dump in the hallway bathroom, right? Like it's
Right.
okay to put some, concessions around these things.
Yeah.
Especially if it makes you more comfortable. But I think Sin said something that's really, really important to kind of focus in on for a second. She said, catch my husband. Well, it's not really about catching, right? But that's a good point to kind of stick on for a second is um I think it's okay for individuals to do what they want to do within the context of the relationship. But then once you start talking about lying or deceiving or doing it behind somebody's back, then it gets a little bit trickier. And the problem is a lot of times it's because of the shame and because of not wanting to start the arguments or make your spouse uncomfortable. And so that's where I think going back to that conversation, like I think Sin and her partner do it perfectly, where it's like, hey, this is something I'm going to be doing. And she says, okay, I just don't want to walk in on you doing it. So let's schedule some times where it's comfortable for you and comfortable for me. But the conversation is being had.
Hmm.
Right. And I think oftentimes what gets people in trouble, and I'm not going to say guys, because it's women too. Like we women
Oh
are
yeah.
just as guilty of hiding things or doing things behind our partner's back that we think they might dislike, especially in terms of porn
Yeah.
that it's better to have that first uncomfortable conversation that breaks the ice than to have that really awkward moment where they walk in on you and now there's a fight and the relationship's falling apart and there's no
Yeah.
Sure.
trust, you know?
And just
That
assuming, like,
conversation's always
making assumptions about, oh, my partner's definitely not going to be okay with me jerking off to porn, so now I have to hide
mm,
it. Like, you haven't even
yeah.
talked to them. You don't even know. That would hurt a lot more than, like, it would hurt me more to just know that they felt that way about me without even giving me a chance or talking to me about it, That's where, like, the pain would come in, like the emotional pain.
Yeah.